Well, it's a delight to be here in Barcelona again, a city where over the years I've had the great fortune to work with different mayors over time as an advisor and see how this city in many ways is the model of some of the things that we're going to talk about. Because to talk about smart cities, you can talk about it from the point of view of technology, you can talk about it from the point of view of politics, you can talk about it from the point of view of design, which I will to a degree, but it's of course how all these three and many more things come together, which is at the heart of making a smart city, not just technologically, but also socially. That's what I want to talk to you about. And I start, in fact, with this slide of some of the research that, in fact, Alison's been referring to that I do at the London School of Economics with colleagues from very, very different disciplines. Some are engineers, some are architects, some are political scientists. And what you see here is, in fact, a comparison of the density, the residential density of a whole series of cities which you see there, from London on the far left, New York and Hong Kong, and it shows the density of these different cities at the same scale. And basically one of the arguments I'm going to be making with you, and hopefully then joining in conversation, is that the shape of the city, the actual shape of the city, is a fundamental aspect of its smartness. The question then becomes, how do you get there if you're not starting, as you are in Barcelona, with one of the densest cities in the world? Therefore, simply put, I'm going to show a few slides of shape and form and how that actually affects things. Now, this happens to be Mexico City. It really could be a number of other cities, but the point about this image is that it's a city that never ends. It keeps on going. It has no edges at all. So what are the impacts of this city in terms of the environment? Well, first of all, it eats up its surroundings. If you don't control a city in terms of its, let's call it middle-aged spread, it just keeps on going. And this picture, taken only about 5 or 6 years ago, if I'd taken it again from an airplane, it would have eaten up what you see there in terms of the green. Now, the impacts there are twofold in terms of the issues that I want to talk about. One is that clearly just eating up the green is not good if you're trying to preserve an ecological balance. But secondly, the amount that you need to travel to get to work is obviously increased dramatically. It's an obvious thing that a sprawling city is negative from that point of view. But the second axis that I want to talk about, very much invited by Alison and the organizers of today's event, is to also link the social dimension. Just think what it means if you spend 4 hours a day commuting to work, which is the average in Mexico City, of what that does to you in terms of the business that you carry out. Imagine you're a nurse or a policeman, not a university professor or a mayor. Imagine if you're a nurse, how do you carry out your business of actually administrating medicine to people? So the social and even psychological impacts of these physical issues, I think, are just as important as the environmental debate. And the two, I think, do come together. And the issue is that we have choices. We wouldn't be here, we wouldn't be having a session today about shaping, transforming, and organizing different planning strategies of cities if we didn't know we had choices. And one is the one you saw a moment ago, which is the Mexico City, the uncontrolled, let everything go because there is no formal planning at all. Another one is this one, the hyper-planned, hyper-controlled, hyper-centralized city, which is the city of Hong Kong. And in what I'm saying, I'm not particularly saying, trying to argue that one is absolutely better than another, but clearly there are consequences that need to be addressed when decisions are made about the efficiency of these cities in terms of their floor plate, if I can call it. Now, the benefits of this I'll come back to in a moment in terms of Hong Kong, but just Think of this, it's a city of 8 million people. The average commuting time in Hong Kong is 11 minutes to move around that city, 11 minutes. 4 hours in Mexico City, 22 million. So these are the sort of dimensions of the debate, but the cost, perhaps, is that you need to live there. And there is a question as to whether people want to live there, or what are the trade-offs about living in such a close proximity to others. So the design of cities, the design of buildings, and the infrastructure that supports them is really what I want to open up this discussion with you about. And I want to also do this with the context of London, a city that I've worked in, as you've heard, through my CV, not just as an academic, but as a sort of fellow traveler of the politicians who make many of the decisions. And I want, if I have time, to also talk about the experience we've had with the London Olympics, which is an example of how to try to make London not necessarily a smart city, it's too big and it's been there for too long to be smart at the moment, but make it just a bit smarter, to actually use an opportunity, just like Barcelona did in '92, to actually turn around an area of East London which has actually been both forgotten by politicians and underinvested and underfunded. The context is well known to everyone in this Expo, that cities which are growing consume a lot of energy. Of course they do. It's where people come together to do work and do business, but therefore they pollute incommensurately more. And the debate is whether it's 65 or 75 or 85, it depends where you are in the world, but on average we're talking about a massive number. 75% of global CO2 emissions comes from cities of one shape or form, therefore a small difference in their CO2 emissions can be very, very important in terms of the global ecological balance. And I think that's the debate that really matters to us. But there's this other side too. And I stress again that it's not just a question of the ecology of a city, it's also a question of the social fabric, and the two come together. Because as these cities are growing, what is happening is that inequality, social inequality, is coming face to face or distributed, that you have poor edges and rich middles in cities, or sometimes actually the opposite. So where do these two conversations come together, I think is important to argue, even in this context, because 1/3 of all new urban residents in the next 25 years, 1/3, 1 out of every 3 of you sitting on these rows, will be living in an environment which is not planned. There's no planning organization which deals with them. They'll be living in some sort of slum without basic infrastructure. Now, in an odd way, that could be an opportunity, and we'll try and talk about that in a moment, because, of course, those at the bottom end of the scale, particularly those economies which are growing, particularly African, Latin American, some of the Asian, not the Chinese environments, are at the moment consuming very low energy environments. So the question is, which way do you go to deal with some of the issues that we see here? Let me try and get rid of that dot. Yeah, there we go. Yes, otherwise it looks as if I'm pointing out something very important over there, which I wasn't. Here's a couple of images which really place the urban question into a global framing. What you see here in these maps, in the dark green, is basically where cities grew in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So a lot of European cities. In the lighter green, you see, such as Tokyo, you see where cities grew in the last 15, 20 years, roughly. In the white is where the UN confirms that growth is actually going to concentrate. So the point I was making is that the concentration of urban development in Africa, in these parts of Asia, less so it's stabilizing in Latin America, is exactly at the moment areas which are on the whole at the lower end of the social and economic scale, but certainly at the lower energy of per capita consumption. So which path we choose, or they choose to go, and how do we help them make those choices, I think is very important. And here's another way of looking at exactly the same statistic. It's just numbers showing you how many people are moving into these cities per hour. So every minute and a half that I'm speaking to you, a new person is born or is moved into Dhaka, into Mumbai, into Lagos, into Kinshasa. That's the rate. So the issue here is not just a question of scale, of making cities smarter, but also to deal with the speed of this change, and what is the infrastructure, what are the politics that we can actually implement to make a difference. And here I want to just show you two charts, or two graphs, which bring these two issues together. Over the years at the LSE, we've been looking at 300-400 cities in different parts of the world. And we've tried to look at it from 2 points of view. If you look at it along the horizontal axis, you have the Human Development Index. Basically, the further you are on the right-hand side, the better off you are. The longer you live, the better educated, etc., etc. The further you go up the vertical scale, the more your ecological footprint. Simplifying it enormously, the more energy you consume per person, roughly speaking. Now, I know that we have 3 Americans on the panel, but unfortunately, it's up there where we're not doing too well. Right? United States, on the whole, American cities use 5 times, that's the amount of energy that we can live in within one Earth, right, that dotted line. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. American cities consume about 5 times the energy per capita. But of course, the quality of life is incredibly high, as one well knows. So the real question is, which I'm posing, is what happens to cities in South Africa, in other Asian cities, and Latin America, as they improve their quality of life? Is that trajectory to follow, or does one perhaps, and this is why Barcelona is so relevant here, does one follow the European model of the more compact, the more concentrated, the more efficient, naturally smart city to actually make this work? So I think the discussion here is really about how to make, how to design, how to organize cities so that they are genuinely sustainable, both from the technical point of view, the ecological point of view, call it that, but also from the social point of view. I'm not expecting you to look at this in any detail at all, but as Tony Vives, the deputy mayor of Barcelona, who's sitting here, knows, in a few weeks' time we're having a major conference in London called the Electric City. And what we've done, I think it's the first time this has been done, is actually look globally at which cities are consuming what and where energy comes from. And this is an extract from that work. And you know, the picture is not great, that's all I can say. There are some really good cities which are doing good things, we'll talk about them in a moment, but across the board it's very difficult, and I'm sure in the panel we'll talk about why that is. And often it has to do with politics more than it has to do with money or than with desire. So let me just go back to a few examples to, in a way, paint this picture of what is happening to the cities that we've been studying and what works and what doesn't work. Here's an extraordinary city, which is São Paulo, the major engine of now the 7th world economy, which is Brazil, in many ways sort of, growing at exactly the sort of pace that London, New York, Barcelona was about 100, 150 years ago, except it's happening much faster. Now, what is happening to the shape of the city is that there are no limits. It's a bit like Mexico City. It's just spreading outwards. And in fact, what looks like a rather romantic view here of housing around the lake is totally informal housing with no sewers, no infrastructure at all, on the water reservoirs of this city. I need not say what the quality of the water of the city is like. It's obvious what's happening. And the commuting times of people who live here, not just to get to work, but to get kids to school, can be something like 3 or 4 hours a day. So it's a very physical issue about planning and containment and control. It's no wonder that you have basically permanent traffic jams in the city, also to do with the vested interests of the automotive industry, which is very, very strong in São Paulo. And these are issues and interests that we know need to be reconciled. So what happens here if the average commuting time is something like 3 or 4 hours in the 7th economy in the world? People who are at least millionaires, if not more than that, have to resort to other forms of transport. So they do this. And it's not actually a joke. There are 1,100 helicopters in São Paulo, the same number as in Tokyo and New York, if you can believe that, where the income, of course, difference between São Paulo or a Paulistano and a New Yorker is really quite radical. Surely this is not the way to go, and therefore reinvesting and rethinking the shape of the city is very important. And there are examples, and I think it's very important to be positive in these conferences. There are examples, and for example, way at the low end, Bogota in Colombia, I could think of at least 5 or 6 other examples, had to face a choice. Not unlike the mayors of Barcelona, 3 mayors after each other from 2000 onwards, did a series of very simple things. This city is as big as London, but growing much faster. The biggest issue there, again, was transport and problems of sort of commuting and traffic and congestion. Most of it happening, by the way, in illegal diesel-spewing buses. Enrique Peñalosa, who was the mayor in 2002, basically organized the system, copying from the Curitiba model, very well known, and using that bus, the dedicated bus lane, the famous BRT, the Bus Rapid Transit, which has basically cut commuting times for those who need it most, and that's the critical point here, to about half. You can see the statistics there. But also, and at the same time, took advantage of the fact that it's actually a roughly flat city. And when I was shown this picture, I was amazed by it. It's about 8, 9 years ago, and it just shows cycle lanes going into the middle of absolutely nowhere. Why? The mayor explained to me, because he can't stop informal development. It's going to happen. It's not the Barcelona or the London issue, but that's what's going to happen there. So he built these cycleways, which underneath them have sewers, water, and lighting. The informal city, that's what you see there, actually then builds itself out around it. And this is how these guys get to work and to school. Now, imagine the relationship between these three compared to the commuter who has to put his kids in the car at 5 in the morning and sleep in the back. So, again, I stress that there's a relationship between two dimensions of designing sustainable cities, designing smart cities at many different levels, which are so important. And Belo Horizonte and Medellin and many other cities are sort of doing similar things. Now, we've done some work which I'm not going to talk too much about. There's a report which is just out and on our website, and I'll leave that at the very end as a reference point, on trying to understand what's happening in some cities so that perhaps they become a model of that. And I'm going to go through that very, very quickly, and some of these are maybe obvious to those of you in the room. Some of the systems may even well be displayed or talked about here. But it's the integration of systems which is the most important thing I want to talk about, and the fact that in all these cities there are mayors who are empowered to do something about it. Sometimes, in fact, in the face of central government, which does nothing about it. And I know that our American friends are bound to be talking about this very issue now that they have a new opportunity over the next 4 years. Now, here are some very interesting graphs of just these 4 cities. If you look at these maps, you see that in blue, more or less, you have economic performance over the last 10 years. And despite obvious blips around 2007 and 2008 because of the global recession, most of these cities have actually performed pretty well over this decade or so. In other words, people have got a little bit richer, they've got jobs, they're doing relatively well. What is extraordinary is that at the same time, and let's look at Copenhagen down at the bottom, CO2, for example, for public transport has actually dropped really quite significantly, while bicycle use has gone up, something which is beginning to happen in London. The cars per household in London at this time of growth, which is also population growth, have actually dropped really quite considerably over time because of the massive investment there's been there in terms of public transport improvements. And so the story in many ways goes on. And what's behind this? What's behind this, I would argue, is good planning. And I think this has to come in very much at the beginning of any conversation. And it's not just to do with technology and small things, however important they are, but the bigger picture of how a city fits into or doesn't fit into its region. We've all learned from Copenhagen. It's a wonderful model, this famous finger plan, which we've in a way redrawn. And what the finger plan is very simply a series of transit rail-based green transport routes which feed the suburbs on the edges of the city, and all the dense new development focuses along these lines. In fact, there are central government regulations which say that if you build a building over an X amount of square meters, it has to be within 500 meters of a major transit route. Imagine if that were to happen on the fringes of Indian cities or American cities for that matter. It would completely transform the nature of what is actually happening. And then you get statistics that you probably won't see from the back of the room, but something like 25% of all residents in Copenhagen are within 500 meters. That's about 5 or 6 minutes from a major, from a public transport hub, and 30% of jobs, that's incredibly high, in terms of also within 500 meters of a transit route. There are other cities which have higher percentages, others that have lower. And I think the question here is, how do you use technology to actually implement these objectives rather than just use technology per se? Stockholm is always winning every single award in terms of the greenest city possible. They fight every year with Copenhagen or Zurich or whatever. It's always those 3 or 4. Now, of course, there's a great history there, but there's a sort of what I would call a DNA of what to do with its own city. And that has to do with what you do with the fabric of the city, and you can see it here. There are areas which become redundant. We know this in Poblenou, here in this city. We know it in exactly the area that we are right here in Llobregat, you know. But rather than throw up and give up in arms, the energy is needed to actually reinvest housing, jobs, and infrastructure to make forgotten areas actually something very positive. And Hammarby is just one of the many examples of actually an incredibly efficient environment where all these buildings that you see are way, way below even the national standards of environmental performance. Now here I want to go back, even though you can't see it well from the room, to this issue of density. What we've done, and this is new material, it hasn't been seen before, except from today's the first time I show it. We've looked at the difference in all the cities that are there, but I'm only going to focus on 3, of where people live and where people work. So on the left-hand side, you have a density map of London, so the residential density of where people are, and you can see it's quite flat. London is a relatively low-density city, certainly compared to others I'm going to show you. Not as low density as Atlanta or Melbourne, for that matter, but low density. That's the work density. In other words, how many people come in on a daily basis, and it's pretty extraordinary when you look at it. And it's something like in the hundreds of thousands of people who move in. So it's how these two talk to each other, which is really an interesting and important issue in terms of the environmental behavior. Because obviously, if the difference is enormous and there's no public green infrastructure, you only have those problems that I talked about before in Mexico City or Sao Paulo. This is New York, the two get closer, but there's Hong Kong. It's absolutely fascinating that the residential and the work are closely connected in many ways, hence the 11 minutes. So look at it this way. The dense infrastructure building form of this city requires a sort of public infrastructure that one knows is extraordinary. And not only is it an 11-minute average that you see there compared to others, but 93% of the population of the city use public transport to get to work. We're happy in London because we're creeping around the 50%. New York is something similar. I don't know what it is in Barcelona, but certainly not 93%. So they're models, I think, for all of us. Now, I think, Alison, I have just enough time to also use the Olympics as a project, which I might share with you as a way to, in a way, deal with the city as a sort of body which has a physiological problem. I mean, all cities are not perfect. There's not one which is ideal. We had to deal with a problem which is what to do with the sick area of London, which is the east side of London. One very important thing we have inherited since 1947 is the idea of one of the great planners of the 20th century, Patrick Abercrombie, that there should be a green belt to contain growth in what was then, let's not forget, the world's first megacity. It was the first city that reached roughly 10 million people in roughly 1920, 1930. And this green belt, which is basically the city has to stop, and then you have farmland, more or less, you can't build on it, is something that the first mayor, directly elected mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, for whom I worked, together with Richard Rogers, reinforced when he came into office. At a time that London was growing and people were shouting, do not do that, you'll kill the economy. Exactly the opposite has happened. But you have to have levers and trade-offs. What the London plan, is what you see here, did is reinforce this green belt, but where you see the stars said there, where they're mainly industrial decaying areas, you can build more as long as there's better public transport. So these two things are always connected. Stop a city spreading, but allow opportunity in the middle, otherwise the economy will die, but also reinforce the public infrastructure. What is interesting, just one small example, there's a density map, residential density map of London. We followed many other countries, particularly Scandinavian countries, in coming up with a grid which says if you are close to a public transport, you cannot build at a lower density than as a minimum. So instead of having a maximum, you put a minimum density. It's a dramatic reversal of planning policy in the UK, but we got it through, and it's actually quite important. Hence, Renzo Piano, wonderful Italian architect, has now built, until 2 days ago, I understand, the tallest building in Europe. Now there's one in Moscow, which is a bit taller. Very interesting. This is over a railway station in South London, and it will probably have 9,000 people working or living there, 47 car parking spaces only for disabled access. Now that's a planning decision. You could not do that in Atlanta, I imagine, or elsewhere. And that's the sort of model of where I think cities need to be going in terms of also having the vision and the technical knowledge behind that to support it to do the sorts of things that I've been talking about. In the few minutes left, I just want to use the Olympics as an example, as I say, of how perhaps you can do this to a piece of city which in many ways I say is sort of problematic, and all cities have that, not just at the social level, but also in terms of environmental performance. Here is a map of London with the River Thames. Central London is roughly over there, but it's drawn in a completely different way. The colors here show you what we call deprivation, basically social deprivation. The darker the green, the less like you are going to have long life expectancy, the less educated you are, the higher the unemployment, etc., etc. Higher number of teenage pregnancy amongst girls, for example. And you'll see that the darker green is concentrated in East London and parts of South London. So there's a problem that anyone needs to solve at the social level. It's also an area that in terms of public transport, with one or two exceptions, is very, very poorly served. And of course the two might well be connected. You can imagine that. In fact, if you are lucky enough to live in West London and brought up there, you live 7 years more today than if you live and are brought up in East London. That's the same difference between Buenos Aires and Quito in South America. It's continental differences within each city. It helps to have $15 billion thrown at you by the government to do something. There's no doubt. The question is, what do you do with it? What choice do you have? And London took the choice to put the Olympics, just like Barcelona did, in its most difficult area. This is what the site looked like only 7 years ago. It's quite extraordinary for me to just look at these pictures. And I'm going to give you the sort of quick story of what happened between there and that's what happened a few months ago, and most importantly, what will happen in the future. The issues that you can see already here from this image is that it's an area of very degraded. It has rail transport, but it's very cut off. It's actually very poorly served in terms of both energy and particularly green energy, even though it has that wonderful water system that you can see there, which connects to water reservoirs which take you up to the north of the UK. And way up there, you can see, and this is a picture taken in 2005, a very large flat piece of land, which is all the earth that came out of the digging of the tunnel for the Channel Tunnel. Right? That came up there. So that immediately tells you that what was a pretty good public transport hub suddenly becomes a fantastically good public transport hub. So you've got land, you've got transport, and you have need for sort of new development. What do you do with it? And this is the quick story, in a way, behind it. Or not. Let's try this. The location I've already stressed where it is. It's in East London, so the yellow line shows the high-speed rail linking to what is still called in the UK the continent and Europe, which at the moment Britain sort of is ambiguous about. But there's an important connection which goes, as I say, nationally and then up to the north, but also a very good transport hub in terms of what happens locally. But this is, as I say, what the area looked like only 6-7 years ago. It really was a dump. I mean, quite literally. It's where lots of goods were actually located in terms of sort of goods such as old fridges and cookers and things like that. It was used for old cars. And what you can see here is that even though you have these rather, nice waterways and nature, electricity pylons marching through the site, which makes it sort of unlivable. So 350 million pounds of the first tranche of the Olympic money went into dismantling this, putting a tunnel underneath this part of the city, therefore actually rewiring this whole part of East London and repowering it. So it's not just a question of social issues, it's also a question of sort of the technology that was invested there. This is what this place was like. Literally any fridge or cooker I threw out of my house ended up over here. So imagine the pollution and everything like that. So a lot of the land was actually cleaned on site. Again, a very sustainable way of actually dealing with that problem. And this is what some of the areas look like, in fact, today and when the Olympics open. Around it, there's a very thriving sort of neighborhood of different constituencies, different backgrounds, and different peoples from different ethnic origins, but I'm not really going to talk about that. This is what this project is about. 3 minutes and I'm finished. It's about reconnecting, restitching the physical, the social, and even the environmental fabric of what London is about, through its waterways, through its green systems, and most importantly, through its lifestyles. The site you see over there, it's a very large site, about 220 hectares, already has a relatively good public transport hub. It has water going through it, and that's where a major park was actually placed. 5 years ago, there was only one road which went through the site. It was not connected at all, because it was an industrial area. 38 new bridges and links were created through the Olympic investment. The other thing, very importantly, is to create housing, to create jobs, and 2 major new energy centers right at the heart of this new piece of city. We only built the sports facilities we needed to last. Nearly all of them were built as temporary structures. So all the red stars are completely temporary and they go away. It's only the blue ones, of which I'll show you 1 or 2, which remains. What it means is that a lot of the investment and a lot of the planning, a lot of the thinking went into cleaning the ground, and you can see a picture, in fact, a few months before the Olympics actually opened, and depolluting it and making it accessible. Let's not forget that this was a car-free games. You could not go by car to the games. You could only use public transport to go to it. So it also creates a sort of sense of what this place might be and sort of rediscovery. And this is how the space was used during the time. Very interesting that even bridges were designed double the size to cope with 100,000 people moving in and out of a stadium. This today, the brown bit, is actually being dismantled because you don't need it that big anymore. So the sustainability was very much part of the design. And buildings like this very beautiful basketball stadium, we don't do basketball. The Americans do it much better than us, so why do it? We're not tall enough, probably, in London. So this whole beautiful structure was designed to actually be demounted, and at the moment there's a conversation with the mayor of Rio who wants to take it over there. So sustainability is actually thought about in a different way. We don't have a velodrome. We win gold medals in cycling. Let's keep it. So that one stays. And this is Zaha Hadid's building, which is actually the Aquatic Centre, rather ugly with these 2 lateral wings. That's temporary seating. All of that is coming out right now, so that the main space will actually look like this when it's finished. So as we speak, all the red stars are being taken away, and most importantly, the most important slide is this one. Platforms, these ellipses of purple-white color, become opportunity for making city. But opportunity for making city, A, in an area which is incredibly well connected now in terms of public transport. B, it's been rewired and has a very, very efficient form of energy that East London didn't have. And C, has the sort of social qualities of a great park, new housing, schools, and other things that we would never have had in this part of London in the space of 7 years. The model is this: why reinvent things when you have under your nose something that works? And that's what London looks like, and that's the greater sort of master plan. So as I say, there are schools, there's energy, there's normal sort of housing in order to make a normal piece of city, which of course is technically more efficient. It does all the sorts of things that smart cities are supposed to do, but within a sort of bigger vision of what actually cities are about. All cities should be designed in this way, whether they have £15 billion or not. And in a way, that's my message, that technology can only be a sort of support to building this bigger vision. Thank you very much.